This is my 1975 Chevy Camaro that I bought to teach myself how to work on cars. And at the end of this build, I'm giving it away to my mom. Now, we've dealt with a ton of problems on this car already, but in this episode we are finalizing the work that we can do before moving all the way down to the beautiful state of Florida to continue working on this in a way that I could never imagine. So buckle up and get ready for an awesome episode, and watch till the very end to find out what's to come. Now, if you're anything like me, you might suffer from loss to toolitis, which is a mental illness that just makes you lose all of your tools in the overwhelming junk pile that is your garage. Now, I do all of my own work in my garage here, and as a result, I have piles on piles of tools and car parts, and it's an absolute disaster, and I can't keep track of anything anymore. And when you can't keep track of tools and you lose them, you start using tools for purposes they weren't intended to. So before I start trying to do bodywork and welding on the car by using a screwdriver as a welding electrode, I need to clean my garage really badly. Now, not only do I have to clean my garage because I keep losing tools, but I'm moving to Florida in 2 weeks. So everything that you see behind me needs to be packed up and ready to move 800 miles down to Florida. And this is not going to be an easy task. So even though I've got 2 weeks to get this done, I'm starting now and we're going to pick away on it little by little so we can get the garage organized again and make working on the car for these final couple weeks here up in Kentucky just a little bit easier. So with that being said, let's get started. So our first step is we need to get the Camaro out of the garage so we've got some room to work with. So looking around the garage, it is needless to say that I have a ton of cleaning work to get done here. I've got shelves piled up with stuff, I've got car parts everywhere, and in this corner back over here, I have a ton of trash and tools and empty bottles, and that's not even considering my workbench that is completely cluttered and I can't even see anymore. I also have a second workbench that is equally cluttered with tools and even more car parts over here. So let's get cleaning. So I started the process by opening all of my toolboxes and my socket sets and firsthand realizing how much was actually missing from them, which is even more reason why this is a great thing for me to be doing here. Then I went through and tried to collect as many pieces as I could from all these sets, and along the way picked up trash and clutter and everything else that was around here, moved some big tools around, and pretty quickly we actually had this back in order. We had a full inventory of all of my tools, all my toolboxes back together, and the garage was looking a whole lot cleaner already. So it was finally time for me to end my hoarding ways, and I decided to finally dump all of the old metal pieces from my first engine build. Now, if you guys have followed the series along the way, you know that every single one of these pieces has been replaced, and I no longer really have use for these old things anymore. So instead of holding on to them for some future project, I decided I'm definitely not going to use these, and let's send them to the dump where they belong. So we finished our first day of cleaning up the garage, and while this may not look like I got a lot done, this is a huge improvement over what we had. Primarily, these giant bins of car parts for the Camaro I now have one of these empty in the garage, and I have one of them full of trash out in my truck. Which means I'm gonna have 2 giant storage bins to fit a bunch of extra parts for the Camaro for the move. Now over here on the workbench, I completely refilled these sets of sockets. I got all of my toolboxes back together. I found all of my wrenches again, which is awesome. I have a full inventory of all of my jack stands. I've got more car parts here. I've got sheet metal here. I've got some engine stuff here and a trunk panel back over there, and then gardening tools and fluids there. So not only did we get cleaned up, but we got a heck of a lot more organized, which is gonna help me so much over the next 2 weeks while I try to get content done and get ready for this huge move that I'm about to take. And of course, before the move, I'm gonna have to put all of these parts back on the Camaro. I've got the wheel wells, I've got the front clip, I've got the bumpers, I've got the other big bumper for the rear over there. We've got a whole lot to do here, so there's no time to waste at all. So now that the garage is cleaned, we have a few holes on this Camaro that we need to patch. Now, because this car is flooded out and there's a ton of patch panels that I need to put in, I needed a really good welder to use. And when Yes Welder reached out to me to offer me the opportunity to test out one of their welders, which is incredibly more advanced than anything that I've ever used, I couldn't pass it up. Now, up until I got my hands on this welder, my old one had almost no settings other than wire speed and voltage. And while this one does share those same settings, it goes way deeper than that. Not only do you have wire speed and voltage, you have a digital readout on the screen that allows you to track everything. Then you also have these extra settings in here that I haven't even really begun to scrape the surface of, but they definitely seem to do a whole lot more. Then you also have automatic settings to check what type of welding you're doing. And obviously we're doing flux core welding, so I'm picking that. And then you also get to pick your wire size, and we're welding with 0.030 wire here, so obviously I'm going to select that. And then with all of our settings customized, we're going to dial it in by doing a couple test welds on some scrap metal here, and these are already coming out so much nicer than any of the welds that I've used my previous welder on. So now it's time to start making our new patch panel for this rusted out chunk of our dashboard. We're going to get our piece fine-tuned in and then trace it on the existing metal that's left on the dashboard. That'll allow us to properly cut out this section of the dashboard to put the patch panel in and hopefully get a very nice, smoothly welded in patch. So then we're going to cut the actual chunk out using our grinder and a cutoff wheel. And once that section's cut out, we're going to go ahead and test fit our panel and make sure that it is completely flush with all of the surrounding metal. This did take a lot of fine tuning to get it here, but once it fits, you know for sure it fits. Then we're going to use a magnet to hold it in place while we get ourselves set up to tack weld it in. And then we just start welding. We're also using compressed air to cool down the welds because flux core welding heats the metal up way more than normal welding. So in between each of the welds, every 2 or 3 of them, I blow this thing off with compressed air to help cool it down just a little bit. Finished the first of many patch panels that are gonna go in this car. And even though Yes Welder sent this to me for free and said, hey, can you say some nice things about our tool? I wanna take a second to say, this thing is genuinely changing how I weld. There's so many more settings on this than my old welder, and I feel way more comfortable using this thing to weld on the car itself. And because it's so customizable, I can remember exactly what my settings were every single time I changed them, so I can go back to using what was working without floundering around and being like, oh my god, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. So even though they sent this to me for free, my genuine opinion is this thing is awesome. Plus, it supports gas, so we can do actual MIG welding in the future instead of just flux core welding. But hey, for flux core, this stuff's looking really, really good. So with the first of many patch panels welded in, I needed to find out how much of the rest of this car was actually salvageable. And as you can see, I've got already a gigantic hole near the window frame here, and I know that a lot of this car is built of Bondo already. There's a lot of holes and things, and I've found a lot of weird DI methods of fixing things along the way, so I just need, for my own conscience, to figure out how much of the metal under here is still actually metal, and is not just metal with a bunch of holes, and those holes are filled with rubber or caulk or Bondo or who knows what at this point. And thankfully, as I started grinding away here and blowing all this dust off, I realized that there's actually quite a bit of salvageable metal here. This is a lot less bad than what I was expecting. Obviously, in the normal places along the window channel here, there's a decent amount of Bondo. And it looks like they used 2 different types of Bondo, so whoever did this had a decent thought of what they were doing, but probably would have been better off just replacing the metal. But as far as a DIY Bondo job, this is actually not that bad, and it did seem to insulate a lot of the good metal from what could have been completely rusted Swiss cheese. Now, even that being said, I do have a gigantic hole in the roof that I need to fill, and even to this day have not fully figured out how far this spans. I was just trying to see if that window channel had a ton of damage all the way along the way, and it looks like it's kind of localized to that one nasty spot. But overall, this is making me pretty happy. I feel pretty good about doing the repair job on this, because patching that is just basically a giant flat piece of metal. Then moving to the passenger side here, I started grinding down, doing the exact same process over here, because I noticed, again, a huge thick layer of Bondo on everything. And surprisingly, there was actually more Bondo on this side than there was on the other side, and I think that's why the metal over here actually looks a little bit worse, even though it's not rusted all the way through to the inside. It definitely trapped some moisture in there and allowed it to eat away at the metal and kind of surface rust it a little bit more. So we're grinding everything down back to bare metal as best as we can, getting through all 3 layers of Bondo that they decided to put down here, making sure that all of this is going to be eventually ready for metalwork and then hopefully paint, and probably our own fresh layer of Bondo that'll go on everything to make sure that it looks nice. Now, as I was grinding all the Bondo, I was following it along the back of the car here, and it took me all the way down to this little panel that goes between the rear window and the trunk pan. And I noticed that there was a very, very thick chunk of Bondo here that seemed to be kind of holding everything together, and also was filling in what looked to be a very large hole. So I decided to chip away at the Bondo here and open up the cavity into the car that it was filling, thinking nothing of it. I'd been doing this along the whole way of the car process. But inside this cavity was something different than what I normally find. There was a little plastic baggie that was full of some stuff. And while I don't want to spend too much time theorizing what was or was not in this bag, it definitely makes me question whether or not this car had been used for some activities that I was not aware of previously. So, putting our strange baggie to the side, it was time to break out the paint stripping discs and see if I could grind through a little bit more of the material on top of the roof here, just so I could see how far this hole spans. Now, I ended up going through and grinding away a ton of the paint and Bondo layers up here, and with each pass, I was getting more and more nervous at the condition of the roof of this thing. What I first thought was a localized little rusted through hole in the back of the roof ended up being almost the entire roof being covered in pitted out rusted metal. And that metal had just been skim coated with about ½ an inch of Bondo all the way across the entire roof, which just insulated the rust and allowed it to grow and spread uncontrolled underneath the paint of this car. Now, with the metal in a condition like this, my only 2 options are either bite the bullet and replace the entire roof panel, or try and do the same thing that the old owners did and just skim coat the whole thing in Bondo and basically hope for the best. But to be 100% sure, I reached out to my friend Jack Builds It, who is basically a bodywork wizard, and he said I could chemical strip it and put some Bondo back over it if the holes didn't go all the way through. But he also said that replacing the roof skin wouldn't be that difficult of a task, and me wanting this to be as good as I possibly can make it, have decided to bite the bullet and order a brand new roof skin for this thing. So that means one very expensive purchase is coming up for a new roof skin, and we kind of have to pause our body work because a lot of things that we need to work on attached to the roof, and now we can't work on them until we have the new roof panel set up. So now that we have to wait to do more body work, I think it's time that we get our fuel tank properly set up. Now, if you remember, I've mentioned across the last couple videos that the old owners of this car have done some very interesting DIY repairs, and one of those was attaching the fuel tank to the bottom of the car using self-tapping screws. So my fuel tank is full of holes that need to be cleaned up and welded shut. And we're gonna see if we can get this fuel tank looking a little bit less grungy. So with the fuel tank prettied up, it was time to see if I could hammer flat a couple of these dents where the metal had been pulled up from the self-tapping screws. Using a bodywork hammer, I tapped around them and did my best to get them as flattened as I could, but without anything to brace on the backside of it, this was definitely a little bit more difficult than it could have been and didn't give me really the results that I wanted to, but they were improved enough for me to feel comfortable starting to weld. Now, when welding a fuel tank, you have to make sure that there's no fuel in it, and more importantly, no fuel fumes left in it. So, obviously, we had to break out the blowtorch to make sure that there was nothing left in the gas tank. Now, I don't have to tell you guys that this is obviously a joke. I did not actually have any sort of worry that there were fumes in there when I put the blowtorch in there, so don't freak out, but definitely don't do it that way. The best way to get all of the fumes and the fuel out of the fuel tank is to leave it outside and let it just evaporate on its own. Our next step here of getting the fuel tank ready to hold some fuel is to, of course, weld all of those little holes shut. Now, along with the new awesome welder that Yes Welder sent me, they also sent me this crazy cool welding helmet and a new set of welding gloves that'll help make all of my welding a little bit safer when I'm working. And carrying on the trend of how awesome this new welder has been, welding these holes in the fuel tank was super easy. So easy, in fact, that I was almost worried that I wasn't doing it right. But with a little bit of grinding, we can see that those holes are now filled, and we're good to start painting. So we got our fuel tank all painted up. It's looking beautiful and black and gorgeous, and this is about ready to go back in the car. But first, we need to restore the straps that are actually gonna hold this thing up underneath the car. Now, funny enough, about 3 months ago, I bought this bench grinder right here, and I have yet to have a really good opportunity to use it, and so today, we're finally gonna be able to have a chance to put this thing to the test. Because this is currently what the straps that are supposed to hold the fuel tank up under the car look like. So we got the fuel tank and the straps all refurbished. They're nice and painted and they're looking great. But now we have to put them back up underneath the car, which requires one of the most annoying pieces of working on old cars. And that is this little thing right here. This is called a clip nut or a J nut, sometimes a U nut, depending on the style of them. And on these old cars, pretty much every single one of them breaks off when you take the component off, so you have to go buy hundreds of these brand new, which they cost about $4 a piece, so it can run you a little steep. But that being said, the installation of this fuel tank should go pretty easily. The straps just hold it up underneath the car. There are 2 nuts that hold the entire assembly together, and once those are in, everything should just hold itself. As per usual, most things are easier said than done, because putting this fuel tank up underneath the car was an absolute pain. My jack wasn't tall enough to actually hold it up underneath it, so I had to lay under there and hold it with one arm and my knee and do my best to get the straps lined up and the bolts lined up so I could get everything tightened up in there and holding the fuel tank up underneath the car. Now, this is not the final install of our fuel tank. There's no fuel pickup inside the tank, there's no hoses connected, so we're going to have to pull this down and put it back in again at least one more time once we get back to Florida. But for now, I just want this up in there because it takes up a lot of space, and I would like to rather move it inside the car rather than somewhere in a moving truck or in the back of my own truck. Thankfully, it didn't take too long for us to get this fuel tank up in there. Those straps got tightened up and the bolts went in pretty smoothly, and once they were locked in there, that officially marks the final piece of the Camaro that we're rebuilding in Kentucky. So with that being said, our Camaro now has to take a pause because in a week, I'm about to move down to Florida and start something even bigger than I could ever imagine. So it's officially tools down time, and all we have to do is put the Camaro back together. Now the bodywork's obviously not done, we've still got holes in it, but we need it assembled so we can trailer the whole car back to Florida. So in the next video, we'll be covering the reassembly of this whole front end, all of the pieces that need to be brought with us, and then trailering it and moving it all the way back down to Florida, where it will stay for the rest of its life. So if you're interested in seeing the content once we get to Florida, please make sure to subscribe. There may be a little bit of a gap in content as I start getting set up back down in Florida, so I apologize for any missed uploads, but I hope to continue to entertain you just as much as I have from my home base here in Kentucky. And with that, the next time I see you guys is going to be in the beautiful Sunshine State of Florida.